The HOA decided that my farm would be a great place for an illegal hotel and started renting out the property without my permission. If there's one thing I've always valued in life, it's the right to take care of what's mine without anyone hassling me. My farm is my home, my livelihood, and the last place in the world I expected to have to deal with a bunch of nosy neighbors who think they can run other people's lives. But it seems that fate decided I needed an extra challenge, because that's exactly what happened when the HOA decided that my property was somehow their problem. It all started, as these things usually do, with small irritations that I tried to ignore. First, they started filling my mailbox with flyers and letters inviting my farm to be part of the community under HOA rules. As if a farm that has been around longer than most of these prefab houses needed to be regulated by a bunch of bored suburbanites. Then came the warnings about the importance of proper rural aesthetics. What did that mean? Basically, that my weathered wooden fence wasn't suitable for the harmonious vision of the neighborhood. But I paid no attention. I threw the cards in the garbage can and carried on with my life. Then, the little attempts to force me to obey began. One day, an inspector showed up unannounced to inspect my property for compliance with environmental regulations. Regulations that I had never signed or acknowledged. He didn't find anything wrong, of course, but it was enough to put me on my guard. Then came the attempts to intimidate. Supposedly, official vans parked near the entrance to my farm. People taking photos without permission. Even absurd complaints about the smell of the animals. That's right. They tried to argue that my farm affected the quality of life of the neighbors, as if the smell of wet soil and cattle was something unexpected in a rural area. But all that was still just a nuisance. The real hell started when I woke up one morning to find a couple of tourists taking photos in my corral. The man, wearing one of those store-bought cowboy hats, waved at me as if we were old friends and asked what time the guided tour started. I must have stood there for a good 10 seconds, trying to figure out if I had fallen out of bed and was still dreaming. What tour? That's how I found out that my farm was being advertised as an authentic rural experience for tourists who wanted to get away from the city for a few days. And it wasn't just any advertisement. They had created a professional website full of photos of my property, which I had no idea how they had managed, and were offering complete packages, including accommodation, food, and even tours of the farm. It was only after scouring the site and finding the contacts that I discovered who was behind this madness. The HOA. Not only had the damn neighborhood association decided that my farm needed to be under their authority, they had also decided that the best way to do this was to literally turn my house into a rural hotel without my permission. I was speechless. They were renting out my property to strangers, without telling me, without a contract, without a penny going into my pocket. The HOA had managed to exceed all limits of human audacity, and, as if that wasn't enough, they were still charging a fortune for the packages. I checked the website. 3 nights in the rustic farmhouse were going for over $1,000, and all this without me even allowing a single person onto my land. My patience, which was already running very thin, ran out. But that's when I remembered something very, very important. That land was not in my name. The piece of land where I grew up, where my family lived for generations, technically belonged to my brother. And my brother? Oh, he wasn't a farmer. He was the mayor of the town. And now the HOA wasn't just riding roughshod over me. They were playing with property that legally belonged to the leader of the municipal government. I've never seen a case of self-destruction as fast as what was about to happen. Look, I'm a quiet guy. I like my routine, my space, and, above all, I like to solve my problems without having to involve anyone. But that morning, when I realized that my farm had been turned into a hotel without my permission, I knew that this wasn't going to be a problem I could just ignore. The HOA hadn't just invaded my property. They had made money out of it. Money that didn't go to me. Money that they pocketed while tourists took pictures of my animals and slept in my house as if they had booked a room on Airbnb. The couple of tourists I met seemed genuinely confused when I explained that there was no guided tour. They even tried to show me the booking on their cell phone, pointing to the HOA's professional page, full of descriptions about the unique experience of living like a real farmer. I wanted to laugh and break something at the same time. It wasn't their fault, of course. But the HOA? Ah, those people were going to pay dearly. I picked up my cell phone and made the first call I needed to make. My brother, the town's mayor, picked up on the second ring. "Hello, missing? What's up? They're renting your land. What's going on?" I explained everything. The website, the tourists, the expensive packages that the HOA was selling using my farm as a backdrop. He was silent for a moment and then let out a short laugh. The kind you let out when you can't believe what you've just heard. "So, the HOA thinks it can make money renting out a property that technically belongs to the city?" "I guess so." "Well, that's great. I was already looking for a reason to put a stop to these assholes. I knew I didn't need to say any more. My brother was a politician, but first and foremost, he was my family. And if there's one thing we've learned growing up in the countryside, it's that no one steps on what's ours without getting paid. While he took care of the legal stuff, I decided I wasn't going to just sit back and wait. The HOA wanted a rural retreat? Well, I was going to make sure that the guests really got the full experience. First, I made a point of getting up very, very early the next day and letting the roosters out right in front of the house where the tourists were staying. If they wanted to live like farmers, they were going to learn what it was like to wake up to the deafening crowing of a rooster at 4:30 in the morning. Then I started my day as I always did, but with a few minor adjustments. I started up the oldest, noisiest tractor I had and drove slowly around the house, pretending to be plowing the land that didn't even need to be plowed. The smell of diesel oil mixed with dust went straight to the open windows, ensuring that no one there had a peaceful breakfast. And, of course, I made a point of moving the cattle very close to the guest house. There's nothing like a bunch of oxen mooing and giving off that wonderful smell of manure first thing in the morning to add a special touch to the authentic HOA experience. But the best part was yet to come. By the afternoon, I was sure that at least a few tourists were rethinking the idea of spending a weekend in the countryside. But the icing on the cake was still missing. The HOA still didn't know that I was in control of the situation. So I went to their headquarters. The woman who ran the HOA, the same woman who had already sent me 1,000 letters and tried to push idiotic rules on me, was at the reception desk with that fake smile that only arrogant people can give. "Oh, you finally came to talk about joining the HOA?" she said, as if nothing was wrong. "Non bien. I came to find out what time you're going to pay me for the money you made renting my house." Her face changed instantly. "I don't know what you're talking about," she replied, trying to maintain her pose. That's when I took my cell phone out of my pocket and opened their website right in front of her. I clicked on the booking tab and pointed to the description. A complete immersion in rural life on a charming farm with accommodation, food, and activities. "This looks a lot like my property. Do you want to try again?" She froze. She opened her mouth, closed it. She swallowed. I could see her brain trying to process some excuse to get out of it. "Well, we're promoting an experiment to bring the community closer to nature and charging $1,000 for it. It was a fundraiser for the HOA on land that isn't even in my name." The silence that followed was wonderful. I could see in her eyes that, at that moment, she knew she had gotten herself into something she couldn't control. But the woman still tried one last trick. "You see, if you want to negotiate a percentage on the profits, we can discuss the possibility of—" I laughed. I laughed out loud. "Oh, you don't understand. I didn't come to negotiate. I came to warn you that you have a few hours before the city government shows up with a fine and a lawsuit." Her face went pale. My brother wasn't a patient guy. If he said he was going to fix it, I knew it was going to be ugly for the HOA, and I wanted to be there to see it. At that moment, watching the HOA woman choke on her own words, I knew that the game had completely turned. She was still trying to hold it together, but it was obvious that her confidence was melting like butter on hot asphalt. I just wasn't going to leave without making sure the lesson was well learned. So, let me get this straight, I continued, crossing my arms, amused by her discomfort. You decided that my farm was going to be a hotel. You started charging for stays. You didn't tell me. You made money out of it. And now that you've been caught, do you think you can negotiate a percentage with me? The silence that followed was almost poetic. She opened her mouth, as if trying to find a way out, but nothing came out. Yeah, that's what I thought, I said, spinning on my heels and leaving before she could come up with some lame excuse. I went straight home and waited. I knew the real damage was yet to come. My brother wasn't the type to pass up an opportunity like that, and indeed, he didn't disappoint. The next morning, I heard the unmistakable sound of sirens. I looked out of the window and saw 3 town hall vehicles and an official car pulling up right at the entrance to my farm. It was the day of reckoning. The tourists who were still there came out of their makeshift houses, looking confused. I don't think any of them expected the rural retreat to include a surprise inspection operation. But for me, it was the best thing I've ever seen. The chief inspector got out of the car with a clipboard in his hand and looked around, already jotting things down. My brother, with that little smile I knew so well, the smile of someone who knows they've won before the game has even started, came straight over to talk to me. "This place is even worse than I imagined," he said, looking around. "They've really turned the place into an illegal resort. And they were charging a lot for it," I added, pointing to some tourists who were looking around as if they'd been caught red-handed committing a crime. But the best was yet to come. It didn't take long for the president of the HOA to show up, and when I say she came marching in like she was about to explode, I'm not exaggerating. "This is an abuse of authority," she shouted, pointing at the inspectors, at my brother, at the cars, at me, at anything that came within reach of her fury. "You don't have the right to invade private property." My brother crossed his arms and raised an eyebrow. "Private property? Ah, so you finally recognize that this land doesn't belong to the HOA?" She slammed on the brakes instantly. I could almost hear the mental click of her realizing that she had messed up badly. "That doesn't change the fact that you can't just come here unannounced." The inspector, who until then had just been writing down the infractions, raised his clipboard and took a step forward. "Actually, ma'am, we can. Since this land belongs to the mayor of the city, and you have used this space to carry out commercial activities without permission, we have the legal right to investigate and fine the HOA for misuse of public property." Bam! Her gaze passed through each of us, as if trying to find some loophole to escape. But there was no loophole. The house had fallen down. "In addition," the inspector continued, relentlessly, "we have analyzed the HOA's financial records, and there are strong indications that the money raised from this rural retreat has not been properly declared." And it was at that very moment that panic appeared on her face. Because it was one thing to annoy a landowner and think you could get away with it, it was quite another to mess with the municipal government and have your tax books analyzed by a team of auditors. "This is ridiculous," she tried to argue. "This is a big mess. We were just trying to offer a rural experience to members of the community." The inspector didn't even blink. "And charging an average of $1,000 per weekend without passing on a penny to the owner of the property?" The silence was deafening. By now, neighbors were gathering at the entrance to the farm to see what was going on. Because, of course, when there's a car in the street, everyone gets curious. And then something even better happened. A group of community residents, who were already fed up with the HOA, started asking questions. "Wait a minute. The HOA was renting this farm without permission, and with our money being used to finance it? But this isn't even HOA land. How did they decide to do that?" The questioning quickly turned into a full-blown revolt, and the final blow came when my brother handed an official document to the HOA president. This is a temporary court order blocking HOA funds until a full audit is done, he said, smiling. You can sort it out with the lawyers. The woman's face was a sight to behold. She tried to argue. She tried to threaten. She tried to say that this was an abuse of power. But no one was listening anymore. The inspectors were already issuing notices of violation. The neighbors were up in arms demanding explanations, and the tourists were trying to get out of there as quickly as possible, realizing that they had fallen for an involuntary real estate scam. I just stood there, watching it all, feeling an indescribable pleasure at seeing that woman finally get a taste of her own poison. At the end of the day, the rural retreat was officially closed. The HOA was slapped with a huge fine, and with the funds blocked, the association's administration began to crumble. But the best was yet to come, because now that everyone knew that the HOA was embezzling money and abusing its authority, the residents began to discuss the complete dissolution of the association. What had once been a group of obedient neighbors was now an angry mob. The woman who once thought herself untouchable was now surrounded by people demanding transparency, asking for refunds, and talking about filing lawsuits against her. And, oh, I made a point of watching every second of that fall. After the public disaster of the HOA, the situation only got worse for the woman who ran this mess. It wasn't just the fine. It wasn't just the court order blocking the funds. It was the fact that, from that moment on, no one respected this woman anymore. Before, people followed the HOA's idiotic rules because they were afraid of fines or problems with the neighbors. But now everyone knew that she was a con artist who tried to turn the mayor's family farm into a clandestine hotel to make money under the table. And when the community realized that the HOA was actually a bottomless financial pit, it was only a matter of time before everything collapsed for good. In the days following the scandal, residents began demanding an extraordinary assembly. They wanted clarification on the accounts. They wanted to know where the money from the fees was going. They wanted to understand why on earth they were paying to finance an illegal rural retreat, while the neighborhood streets were full of potholes. The HOA president tried to resist. She called a closed meeting for board members only, trying to prevent the community from having direct access to the finances. But that was her problem. No one was playing by the HOA's rules anymore. So the residents organized their own meeting. The event took place in the neighborhood church hall. The intention was simply to discuss the future of the HOA. But when more than 100 people showed up, people who had never attended a single meeting before, it became clear that this was not going to be a smooth conversation. I went, of course. I wanted to see this woman's final downfall up close. Things got off to a relatively civilized start. The vice president of the HOA, a gentleman in his 60s, who was probably only there because his wife made him, tried to start the meeting by asking for calm. We're all here to find a way for the community to move forward together. He was interrupted almost immediately. United? You embezzled our money to pay tourists to sleep on other people's farms. United? The HOA spent our community fund on an Airbnb scam, and now you want us to pretend nothing happened? We want to see the bills. Where's the money? And that's how it started. The HOA president finally stood up, trying to hold her pose. As explained earlier, this was all a big misunderstanding. What we tried to do was create a community experience that would benefit everyone. So where's the money? She swallowed, because that was the real problem. The audit was still ongoing, but it was already clear to everyone that the HOA's finances were very, very wrong. The documents that the inspectors analyzed showed that absurd expenses were being recorded without explanation, payments to companies that nobody knew about, administrative fees that had never been voted on by the community, and, of course, the money from the clandestine hotel reservations had simply disappeared. And then came the final blow. One of the neighbors, a retired accountant who apparently decided to investigate the HOA's books on his own, stepped up and dropped the bomb. Here are the last 3 years of HOA transactions. I cross-referenced this information with the financial transactions in our community account. Do you know what I discovered? Almost $40,000 disappeared in unrecorded expenses. The room was silent for a moment. Then it exploded. $40,000. The woman tried to argue, tried to defend herself, but no one else wanted to listen. The HOA members themselves began to turn away from her, realizing that they were being dragged into a disaster of no return. Then came the vote. "Shall we break up the HOA?" someone shouted. And then the votes began. In less than 5 minutes, it was decided. The HOA was officially dissolved. And the woman? Well, she sat there, watching the little empire of control and arrogance she had built crumble right in front of her. It was a spectacle. The residents were no longer just angry, they were free. Free from the absurd fines for letting the grass grow half a centimeter longer than allowed. Free from the ridiculous rules about door colors, mailbox types, and times to put out the garbage. Free from having to deal with a neighborhood dictatorship run by someone who turned out to be nothing more than a fifth-rate criminal. The next day, cars started pulling up in front of the former HOA president's house. They were lawyers, investigators, local reporters. Everyone wanted to know what the hell had happened there. She held back as long as she could, but in the end, the damage was done. The last I heard about this woman was that she had sold her house and moved to another state. Well, my farm is back to what it always was. My place, my piece of land, with no one to tell me what to do or how to do it. Peace returned to the neighborhood. The neighbors were more united than ever, and I never had to worry about another ridiculous intrusion. And if another HOA ever tries to show up here, well, I guess you know how this story ends. And if you liked this video, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel.